Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121. This is Reassessing the Late Bronze Age Collapse. All right, so around 1200 BCE, the societies of the Eastern Mediterranean underwent what historians have traditionally described as a catastrophic collapse. So what we see are the Mycenaean Greek palaces disappearing, the Hittite Empire collapsing, the New Kingdom ending in Egypt. Now, in Syria and the Levant, things are a little bit less serious, but even there, we see a marked decline in urbanism. So this is the beginning of what has sometimes been called the Dark Age, or, quote, the worst disaster in ancient history. Now, most textbooks give a simple, straightforward, and succinct account of the traditional narrative. And I'm going to spend the next little while confusing matters completely, because history is messy, and there are no neat explanations for a period like this, and that is the lesson that I'd like you to take away from tonight. Now, the harder you try to point to single dominant causes for massive historical change, the more completely I think the narrative that you're trying to construct will tend to unravel. So when we talk about the late Bronze Age collapse, we really need to talk about categories of different explanations. So there's warfare, so this could be invasion, raids from outside, or civil war. There's natural disaster. This could be drought or famine, earthquakes, disease. Systems collapse, which is something considerably more complex that we'll also discuss in this lecture. It's almost impossible to develop an absolute chronology for what was going on here, too, because we have virtually no written evidence. Some of the few exceptions are things like Ramses Medinet Habu inscriptions that we talked about in the last lecture. But really, looking for any single theory understates the complexity. And each of these categories of explanations have flaws. So we're going to look at those tonight, and we're also going to look at why the concept of a collapse is a bit problematic. So let's talk about the scope of the destruction, just to get a sense of what was really going on. It is exceptionally broad. We have examples that can be found throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor. There are dozens of sites that are destroyed or abandoned. Every significant Anatolian site from this period has a destruction layer. So in the Hittite Empire, there is serious interruption of occupation at multiple sites. Their capital, Hattusis, was plundered and burned, as were many other major cities. Now, on Crete, we see the destruction of Knossos and the abandonment of other sites. What we do see at the same time is a sort of upswing in the inhabiting of smaller villages and hamlets. So perhaps this was a safer way of living. There are 3 major sites on Cyprus that were destroyed twice in the period of a few decades. They were reoccupied afterwards, but several of the smaller cities on the island were completely abandoned. There's one particularly interesting example at Kokino-Kremos, where a goldsmith appears to have hidden gold and jewelry, clearly expecting to come back, and yet he never did. And there are other hoards of different goods at the same site. Now, in Syria, Ugarit is perhaps one of the most famous sites from this period. It was burned and not reoccupied, and Ugarit had been a major trading and economic center. So it's quite significant that it was abandoned in this period. We have an interesting body of source material from Ugarit. There were about 100 clay tablets that were found in the city's ovens. They were either being fired for preservation or they fell in when the building collapsed, and they are actually known as the letters from the oven. Most of them are either to or from the last king of Ugarit. There is a letter from him to the Hittite king that seems rather ominous. One of the lines from this letter says, "The enemy advances against us, and there is no number. Whatever is available, look for it and send it to me." I mentioned a letter in the last lecture that the king of Ugarit had sent to his father-in-law, the king of Cyprus. I'll just read you an excerpt from that. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country? Thus the country is abandoned. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. There is another letter to a person we cannot identify from the king, and it says, our food is on the threshing floor is burned, and also the vineyards are destroyed. Our city is destroyed, and may you know it. So obviously these are copies of letters that were already sent. It really speaks to quite a desperate situation in and around Ugarit. We don't really know why. Now, as I mentioned, elsewhere in the Levant, there's less damage, but cities that are along the route from Egypt to Syria are all destroyed. This is often taken as evidence for the sea peoples, obviously. Smaller towns are also abandoned in this period. What's interesting is some settlements seem to have been spared, and some of them were quite large. So Jerusalem, for instance, was not badly affected in this period. We simply don't know why some areas appear to have escaped. Now, in Greece, there is a wide variety of mainland sites that show evidence of destruction, usually fire. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, numerous others. We know the palace system conclusively ended in this period. Many smaller communities were simply abandoned. Now, there is some interesting evidence in the archaeology that there were actually 2 waves of destruction in Greece. In the earlier wave, palaces and other major buildings were damaged, and this led to increased fortification at many of the major settlements, as well as, for instance, more work done at the citadels to ensure water supply. So we see also new defensive settlements, as well as fortifications in the islands. Well, now, was this all some type of response to ongoing insecurity? The final destruction of these sites in Greece appears to have happened very fast. In Thebes, archaeologists have actually found tablets that were burned while they were still wet. Now, Egypt's situation is a bit different. Its cities are not burned. It did, however, lose most of its power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Ramses III was essentially the last great pharaoh. And of course, we have already talked about inscriptions that discuss the situation, Medinet Habu being the big one. Now, why does Egypt suffer at all if its cities are not burning? Well, their seemingly unlimited wealth had been a cornerstone of Egyptian power. The lack of access to gold and the lack of access to, diplomatic ties. Well, now you don't have kings and emperors in the area to deal with anymore. This does diminish their diplomatic power. Now, we do have evidence as well in Egypt that they went through a period of low floods and crop failures, which is a recipe for political and social unrest. And this would have required them to sort of pull in and deal with problems at home. So it's not so much a decline in Egypt's power, perhaps, as a sort of contraction of it. Ramses' successors, were simply unable to maintain a presence in the Levant. They were also dealing with invasions from Libya, more above and beyond the first one during Merenptah's reign. The Libyans do manage to infiltrate the Nile Delta in the end, and they even set up their own pharaohs in the 10th century BCE. All right, so that gives you some sense of the breadth of what was going on, basically. So how has it been explained? So I want to touch on one of the most traditional explanations, first of all. And this is what's known as the Dorian Migration theory. It is Greek-centric. It doesn't try to explain the entire Late Bronze Age collapse. It focuses on indications that the Greek people of the time were aware of impending disaster. So the scholars who wrote about this pointed at things like the strengthening of fortifications at Mycenae and Tiryns, the work on the water supply. Apparently there was also a wall built across the Corinthian Isthmus at this time. Now, the Pylos tablets, which are written in Linear B, talk about watchers and rowers. They were obviously written under the stress of defending the city of Pylos. I mentioned that this second wave of destruction was very swift, so it does, in the 19th century, suggest outside involvement to a lot of the scholars writing about the period. They decided to settle on the Dorians as culprits. So, who were the Dorians? So, fast forward to the 5th century BC in classical Greece. Many of the Greek cities claimed that they had a shared Dorian heritage. And Greek linked cities in Asia Minor, North Africa, uh, Sicily, and South Italy also looked at the same cultural context and said, yeah, we're Dorian too. The Spartans actually used it as a way to create alliances during the Peloponnesian War. This is a literary tradition about migration. So the literary tradition says that the Dorians had lived in north-central Greece, but they were led into the Peloponnese by the descendants of Heracles, trying to retake their ancestral lands. And Thucydides dates their migration to 80 years after the Trojan War. The sources claim that they displaced the Achaeans into the northern Peloponnese, while the Ionians went to Athens and then into the east to settle the Cyclades in Asia Minor, and that the cities elsewhere are accounted for by later Dorian expeditions. So how credible is this? Well, it is based on the historical distribution of Greek dialects, but again, this is all linguistic evidence. Names, place names, that sort of thing. As I've mentioned in our previous lecture, I have certain suspicions about linguistic evidence for historical change because there are so many ways to explain how languages develop. Archaeology isn't as helpful as you might think. Now, there are certain new developments in this period, so new types of artifacts, new cultural forms that are seen in the Mycenaean world, and new practices of burial, for instance. But again, how do we distinguish between customs that come along with people and customs that are simply picked up by people who are encountering other people? It's very difficult to attribute things like single inhumation to a specific group. Now, another point, the literary tradition talks about how the Dorians ousted Agamemnon's grandson, but it doesn't talk about the city being destroyed. And there were certainly cities destroyed that never wound up being settled by Dorian populations. So what do you make of sites that are abandoned and remain abandoned in territories that in the classical period would have been considered Dorian? It simply doesn't fit. I mean, let's be realistic. There are 4 centuries between the events that the literary tradition is talking about and the earliest written versions of it. So what did it look like in the oral phase? It's impossible to know. Certainly it would not have been a single unified story. It's actually much more likely that the literary tradition is a retrospective attempt to establish a common heritage. That it's basically pieces that are assembled out of a hazy oral tradition reflecting the movement of various peoples during the time. So let's dump the Dorian migration theory. What about the Sea Peoples? So think back to that last lecture and think about the Sea People narrative, which, as we discussed, was first initiated by Gaston Maspero. Where does it come from? So here's the thing. This is an idea that is, in fact, I would argue, and that many other scholars would argue, is projected backwards from the Völkerwanderung, which is the folk wandering theory of migration that's developed to explain the end of the Western Roman Empire and the development of, new national identities. Speaking as initially a historian of that period, that idea no longer really exists in the same form as it does. It was meant to replace the theory of the barbarian invasions, which in and of itself is problematic. I mean, if those people were moving, why were they moving? If they were migrating, what caused them to migrate? Do they have a goal in mind? Are they being pushed by factors we can't see? I mean, we cannot answer these questions for the 4th and 5th century CE, let alone for the 13th century BCE. So really, we had no business as scholars pushing the Völkerwanderung back into that period as well. But this is a really good example of how historians in the past have tended to see repeating patterns. So they want to find sort of a narrative arc that will fit the evidence. And that simply does not work most of the time. Now, If you separate the sea people narrative from the idea of national migrations, however, there's more sense to it, because they may very well have been pirates or raiders or mercenaries striking at royal centers. There is one scholar, Drews, who argues that the collapse in the Aegean was the result of new military innovations, specifically barbarian infantry defeating armies of charioteers due to new weapons and tactics. So he points to things like new types of swords, javelins, as well as defensive armor. And these are all things that supposedly the sea peoples used. Now, what Drews argues is that chariot warfare basically gives way to foot soldiers, and as a result, armies become much, much larger. This has really been a hot theory since the early 90s. There have been a lot of people who've questioned it, however. I mean, we don't really have evidence that Bronze Age armies were so dependent on chariots. We certainly had great powers that enjoyed chariots a great deal. Egypt and the Hittites being the big ones. And certainly, if Bronze Age armies had used infantry, they would be lightly armed, usually of low status. So they would not have been put into pictorial scenes of warfare, which would have preferred, epic scenes of individual combat, or what was the pharaoh up to. And arguably, some of the new weapons that Drews thinks came into widespread usage during this period, didn't actually. That they actually predated, the sea peoples. New types of swords, for instance, are actually seen considerably ahead of the sea people battles that we've mentioned. Now, again, Drew's hypothesis rests on the ideas that these were raiders, not people migrating. But as I've already mentioned, we have at least one case where these invaders were accompanied by their families and by their possessions, as I mentioned. So you cannot say that the sea peoples were all migrants searching new lands, but you can't say that they were all raiders. They were diverse. They're not organized. They're not homogenous. These groups could have included pastoralists or nomads, landless peasants, mercenaries. It's very hard to say that they were all one thing, because that was likely not the truth. So really, there's also the possibility that this sort of demographic turmoil that's described as the sea people migrations or invasion is actually a symptom of the problem rather than a cause of the late Bronze Age collapse. And if that's the direction that you're going to take, if you're turning away from political explanations, where do you look next? Certainly, a big one would be environmental factors. So, it is difficult to reconstruct ancient climate, obviously. We're reliant on very questionable documentary sources and proxy sources as well. And although the proxy data is scientific, it still requires interpretation. Now, think about it. We've had some rough winters the last little while. So maybe on social media you've said, oh, it's still snowing. Why is it still snowing? It's never going to stop. It's Snowmageddon. Ragnarok is here. This is the Fimbulwinter. Sorry, that's maybe just me on social media during the really bad winters. Imagine 1,000 years from now, historians reading what you had to say about the winter that didn't stop snowing until April. How do they know that you're just being overdramatic, really? How do they know? They don't. All they have is the comments that you made. So they may interpret things to have been much more serious than they actually were. Now, that being said, some of the evidence that we do have for drought is suggestive. We know that late Bronze Age settlements had a very careful system of redistribution of resources. If they had a single drought year, that could be managed through rationing, but anything more than that is a problem. Any sort of extensive drought cycle would strain this system. And certainly, we don't see any evidence of sustained efforts to improve technology, so no new irrigation systems and so forth. Perhaps some of these societies are religiously conditioned to believe that they did not control the cycle of the weather, and that responding to bad weather needed a religious response instead. Now, Carpenter in the 1960s initiated the environmental school of thought on the late Bronze Age collapse. He argues that there was a shift in winds from the Sahara and that the jet stream was basically displaced because the ice caps were melting. So as a result of this, conditions further south become more arid. Conditions further north become more arid. Misreading my notes, that's great. Climatologists in the 1950s had already started to compare rainfall readings. Greece, in particular, is sort of on the boundary between regions where they get too much moisture and regions where they get too little. And this can sometimes mean dramatic rainfall differences. So, for instance, in 1954 to 55, southern Greece only got 60% of its usual rainfall. Now, what else do we have evidence-wise from the Eastern Mediterranean that suggests the possibility of a drought? We know, for instance, that the Hittites moved their capital a couple of times, possibly to areas where the food was more plentiful. We also see the Libyans trying to push into Egypt, where water availability was not dependent on rainfall. Now, conversely, there are some historical climatologists who argue there was an ice age at the end of the Bronze Age, just a miniature one. Now, there's something you got to remember about climate, to be fair. Climate has sort of got like four parts to it. There is hot and cold, but there is also dry and wet. And an excess along any of these axes can be a threat to an agricultural society, especially one that is still fundamentally a subsistence level society. I mean, what we can survive as a technologically advanced society is very different than what, say, the Hittites could survive. The abandonment of cities may have been a necessity. Think about the size of the non-productive population that had been sustained by farmers. If that is no longer feasible, they need to have smaller, self-contained villages that would be not independent so much as just able to look after their own people. Now, the Hittites we know were particularly susceptible to famine, and that is referred to over and over again in our sources. Hittite rulers are constantly complaining about grain shortages. Now, there are local records from one particular Hittite city that shows years where many houses or family members were sold, quote, in a time of war or famine. So, if you're going to try and save the rest of your family, maybe you're going to sell off your daughter. It's a bit grim, I know. Now, because the Hittites were dependent on rainfall agriculture, they may have been more aggressive in their expansion. And this could explain why they pushed their borders so hard, why they got involved in so many conflicts on so many different fronts. Now, it could even explain civil war between the Hittites themselves. Tudhaliya fought Kurunta, who was the ruler of southern Anatolia. He may have broken away from the empire. Now, when he did break away from the empire, this cuts Hattusis off from its major port. It was dependent on imports, especially from Europe. Now, Pharaoh at the time included, I believe it's in the Amarna letters, about having sent grain, quote, to keep alive the land of Hatti. So there was some sense of collective responsibility there, or at least of charity. The Ugarit letters include one that was directed at the king of Ugarit, telling him to hurry up and send grain. That was a matter of life and death. Now, can we definitively say there were critical drought conditions at this point? No, absolutely we can't. The evidence, again, is merely suggestive. The documents can exaggerate. There can be other explanations for events. We have no grounds to say that this was the reason for the collapse, but it was certainly a factor. So what about earthquakes? Now, Claude Schaefer, who excavated in Ugarit in the 1920s, decided that the city had actually been destroyed by a catastrophic earthquake. He believed that many other wrecked palaces and cities had suffered the same fate, and he argued that an act of God ended the Bronze Age. Now, archaeologists who've looked a little bit more closely at Ugarit since then think that if there was a quake, it probably happened around 1250 BCE, and there was rebuilding afterwards, so this wasn't the final destruction. Now, all of this being said, there is material in the archaeological record that provides many examples of what might be earthquake damage in this period at a large number of eastern Mediterranean sites. It's not clear-cut because it can't be clear-cut. Destruction layers are open to interpretation. Now, the discipline of historical seismology also looks at more recent quakes as indications of what we might logically have expected to see in the distant past. And certainly many of the areas in the eastern Mediterranean are earthquake-prone zones. Is there an archaeological bias against attributing destruction layers to earthquakes? You do find some scholars who argue that. It's generally been ruled out as a major issue in the late Bronze Age collapse because the destruction is simply so widespread. I mean, what kind of quake could have done that? Not any that we know of. And if it wasn't one quake, is it believable that so many came in quick succession? The monocausal explanation to explaining the late Bronze Age collapse has led some scholars, including the most famous, to rule out the idea that earthquakes could have had any influence, because if it wasn't the reason, then it wasn't important, right? But really, it's logical to suggest that some of the destruction, especially in particular places, may very well have been due to earthquakes. So we have examples of this when we look at the tilted or collapsed walls in some of these sites. We have skeletal remains that are buried within rubble layers. Less than you might have expected, but after all, casualties in cases like this are often dependent on the time of day. If it happens in broad daylight, while people are out and about, there are going to be fewer casualties than if it happened at night. Now, you see some evidence for earthquake damage, as I said, but it doesn't exclude any other factor that could have contributed to the destruction. Natural disasters happen even amidst more human-scale conflicts. It's not a weakness in any argument to consider the effect of events that, for all that they're not hugely common and they're oftentimes not even destructive, they happen a lot. Now, another thing to take into account is that what might be a moderate earthquake to us could be a severe earthquake to ancient people, simply because their construction methods weren't as good. Now, because the destruction of this period happens over the course of several decades, it's not possible for a single earthquake to have caused all of this. Subsequent earthquakes, however, seismologists are starting to be able to observe patterns. So one of these patterns is that there are later earthquakes in similar areas, often alongside similar plate boundaries. They're not predictable, but they're still sequences that happen over longer time gaps. This is where we get the idea of earthquake storms. So the eastern Mediterranean would be prone to this because of its geophysical conditions. And a lot of the people who write just don't seem to acknowledge that the earthquake would have had a disproportionate effect on some people's mental well-being as well. Now, think about it. If you lose a family member in an earthquake that happens in the city, you might have some choices to make about where you want to continue living. What happens to your attitude on this subject if more earthquakes appear there? What happens if your society is already unstable when earthquakes start happening? If the if the city is not offering you the benefits it used to, if there's a shortage of food and political instability, and then it starts falling on your head on a regular basis, you might want to move. So this could be one of the reasons why people are shifting away from cities. All right, so to close things out, let's look at this concept of systems collapse. Now, since about the 1990s, historians have been working with an idea that the Bronze Age in the eastern Mediterranean ended due to a shift in patterns of production. that came along with changes in trade networks, the end of the bronze industry, the beginning of ironworking. Now, this concept also recognizes a set of fatal flaws in late Bronze Age kingdoms. They are seen as overly centralized and stratified, as including too significant a gap between rich and the poor. As an example, the Mycenaean palaces are seen as overexploiting the soil in their region because they centralize so much population. They focused too heavily on the redistribution of resources. They needed huge labor forces for building, and they were demanding more than their land could give food-wise. Now, if you're going to go with this particular theory of systems collapse, it involves rejecting the idea that military factors were a prime driving force of the collapse. Not that they had no influence, just that they weren't the reason. The basic idea here is that the system is already falling apart, that we already see depopulation and the breakup of villages and debt slavery. And yes, cities were burned, possibly by sea people, but why were they not rebuilt? They had been in the past. So scholars who make this argument are arguing that something more fundamental had already been broken. Now, this school of thought tends to add in climatic and environmental factors, drought, plague, so forth, as contributing problems, but they argue that it is the imbalance in the economy that's the central problem. So, when maritime trade routes start to break down, it cuts off the supply of copper and tin, which damages bronze production. And because the economies in these areas were so centralized, the consequences were more severe. The one downside of this theory is that it really does not explain the physical destruction. So the burning of cities, the loss of palaces. So what we do see, again, is people who make this argument leaning towards blaming things like earthquakes for these losses. So they paint the physical destruction as almost incidental. And I'm not really sure that that's fair because, we can't blame earthquakes for some of the cities and palaces that were destroyed. The evidence doesn't support it. I think what we have to remember is that whatever did happen in this period, there were passive factors and there were active factors. Even this very broadly based theory is not quite broad enough. Should we even be talking about collapse? Or should we be seeing it as a transformation? I've mentioned to you guys I am a late antique historian by training. And certainly we've been phasing out the idea of the fall of the Roman Empire for a while now. Actually, I've always felt a little bit hypocritical giving this lecture. The idea that this was a dark age is as wrong-headed as arguing that the 5th, the 6th, the 7th century in Western Europe was a dark age. It was something different. And maybe there was regression in some areas of society, but why does that make it dark? Why does that not just mean that it's change? The application of sort of moral judgment to historical change is very tricky and not something we really should be doing, at least not in terms of periodization, certainly. The late Bronze Age collapse or transformation has to be seen as a process. You see as you look at it carefully that there is fast decline, there's gradual decline. There are moments of destruction, there are moments of rebuilding. There's abandonment, there's a shift in population. Different forms of living are emerging. Were they better or worse than what came before? Why are we talking about better or worse? What is the point of that? What makes long distance trade so much better than local trade? Is it because you can get more things? Is that necessarily a good thing? Is that what makes life good? You're seeing some of the problems here, I hope. Now, to be fair, too, the monarchies did survive in some areas. Iron Age Cyprus has royal residences and other symbols of royal status. So there are winners and there are losers. Now, certainly there was a major decline in literacy, and that is fair to note. Writing is nearly extinct in Anatolia and the Aegean. It does survive elsewhere, but at a reduced level. So our historical traditions are very obscure during the early Iron Age. But again, we need to be careful about using writing as a marker of the level of a civilization. Certainly, it is a less prosperous world than it had been. There's no monumental architecture, fewer luxury goods. But does that justify calling it a dark age? I leave it up to you. All right, thanks very much, guys. That will do us for the Late Bronze Age collapse, and I will see you all at the Zoom session.